The black waitress had spent years working double shifts at a small diner, earning just enough to get by, but she never let exhaustion dull her kindness. So when she saw a frail boy in a wheelchair shivering in the rain outside, she didn't hesitate. She brought him inside, gave him food, and made him feel safe. Across the street, a billionaire was watching their every move. That billionaire was the boy's father, and her simple act of kindness was about to open doors she never imagined possible. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the pavement of Lexington Avenue, turning the cracked sidewalk into a slick, uneven mess. Street lights flickered their dim glow, barely illuminating the worn-down buildings that lined the street. It was late past 11 and the diner was supposed to be closing, but Nia Reynolds had never been the type to turn someone away. Not when they needed help. Not when the world had already duffed to kick them down. She was wiping down the counter, her chestnut-brown skin damp with sweat after a grueling 12-hour shift, when she noticed the small figure outside, a boy hunched over in a battered wheelchair. His dark hair plastered to his forehead, a tattered coat barely shielding him from the cold. He was sitting just beyond the neon Lexington Diner sign, hands gripping a frayed blanket that did nothing against the chill. Nia frowned, setting her rag down. She pushed open the diner door, shivering as the wind hit her. Hey, sweetie," she called gently, crouching beside him. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The boy flinched at first, then looked up, his blue eyes wide, uncertain, searching. "I'm waiting for my dad," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the rain. Nia glanced up and down the street. No one. Just the dim glow of a pawn shop's "Cash for Gold" sign flickering across the road, the sound of tires hissing against wet asphalt. "Where is he?" she pressed, concern creeping into her voice. The boy shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Nia exhaled, biting her lip. She'd seen too many nights like this, too many kids left waiting for someone who wasn't coming. "Well, you can't stay out here. Not in this mess." She offered a warm smile. "Come inside with me, okay? It's warm, and I've got something special for you." The boy hesitated for a second, then slowly nodded. Nia gently took hold of the wheelchair's handles and pushed him inside the diner, the warmth hitting them immediately, the scent of buttered toast and burnt coffee wrapping around them like a blanket. She led him to a booth near the radiator, draping a fresh towel over his shoulders before crouching to meet his eyes. "I'm Nia," she said, flashing another grin. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The boy sniffed, his fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. "Liam." Nia nodded approvingly. "That's a strong name. You hungry?" He nodded hesitantly. Nia didn't wait for him to say more. She was already moving toward the kitchen, pulling out a fresh loaf of sourdough, slicing it with practiced ease. A few minutes later, she set a steaming plate in front of him, grilled cheese, golden and crisp, with a bowl of tomato soup on the side. Her go-to comfort mouth, one her grandmother used to make when the nights were too long and the world felt too cruel. "This one's on me," she said, tucking a napkin into his lap. Liam's blue eyes widened as he took his first bite, the cheese stretching in long, gooey strings. "This is the best thing I've ever had," he murmured, his voice laced with something close to wonder. Nia chuckled, watching as he devoured the sandwich. "Good food makes everything better," she said lightly. But inside, she felt the familiar acheth one that came when she saw someone so young, so small, already carrying the weight of the world. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. Across the street, a sleek black Bentley sat idle in the shadows, its tinted windows reflecting the diner's neon glow. Inside, Graham Whitaker sat in silence, his sharp gray eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. At 46, Graham was a man who had built his empire on control, precision, ruthlessness. Whitaker Dynamics was the beating heart of Baltimore's tech industry, a billion-dollar machine that ran on efficiency, not sentiment. And Graham, its CEO, had spent years ensuring that nothing, no person, no emotion, no weakness could interfere with that. Yet here he was, watching, listening, thinking. Liam was his son, and that woman, that black waitress in a cheap apron in a run-down diner, was feeding his son for free. Nia refilled Liam's water glass and added a second grilled cheese to his plate without asking. She didn't care if she'd have to cover the cost herself. The kid was hungry. That was enough. "So," she asked gently, sliding into the booth across from him. Your dad? You sure he knows where you are? Liam nodded, chewing slowly. He told me to wait, said he had to take a call. Nia tilted her head. When was that? Liam glanced at the diner clock above the register. An hour ago. Maybe more. Nia's chest tightened. Do you want me to call someone? Do you have a number I can reach him at? Liam shook his head. He said not to bother him. That he'd be back when he could. She exhaled through her nose. That was a red flag if she ever heard one. But she didn't push. Not yet. Instead, she stood and went to the kitchen. She pulled out an extra blanket from the supply shelf, the one she usually kept for herself when the heat went out in her apartment. When she returned, Liam had already started to doze off, crumbs on his cheeks, arms curled protectively over his stomach. Nia carefully draped the blanket over him and dimmed the lights. Across the street, Graham watched all of it, the care, the patience, the way Nia had stepped in without asking for anything in return. He checked his watch. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour. Long enough to test her. Long enough to see what she'd do when no one was watching. He pressed a button on the armrest, and the car door opened silently. Stay here, he told his driver. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time he crossed the street and entered the diner. The bell above the door jingled, startling Nia. Sorry, we're closed, she said automatically, standing up. Graham took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Liam, still asleep in the booth. You fed him, he said. Nia's posture stiffened. He was cold and hungry. I didn't know he had anyone looking after him. Graham's voice was even controlled. I was watching. I wanted to see what you'd do. Nia blinked. You? Left him there? In the rain? I needed to know if someone would care when there was no reward in it. Her eyes narrowed. Is he really your son? Graham nodded. Adopted. He's been through more than any child should. And I've been looking for someone who sees him, not the chair, not the name, just him. Nia crossed her arms. And abandoning him in the cold is your way of finding out who's kind. Graham's gaze didn't falter. Sometimes the only way to see true character is to remove the script. She didn't know what to say to that. It made her angry. It made her sad. But mostly, it made her wonder why someone with so much power had to test people like that. I didn't do it to be seen, she said. I know, Graham replied. That's why it mattered. He pulled out a card and placed it on the counter. My assistant will call you tomorrow. I'd like to offer you a position. Nia stared at him. A position doing what? He glanced at Liam. Helping me give him a life worth living. Nia stared at the card on the counter, the thick white stock embossed with gold lettering that simply read, Graham Whitaker, Whitaker Dynamics. It felt out of place on the grease-stained countertop, next to the chipped napkin holder and the worn salt shakers. She didn't pick it up. I don't need charity, she said. It's not charity, Graham answered calmly. It's recognition. For what? Doing what any decent person would do? Graham gave a slight nod. Exactly. That's what makes it rare. Nia exhaled slowly, her hand resting on the counter's edge. She looked past him, at Liam still curled under the blanket she gave him. And what happens to him tomorrow? Or the next day? You just leave him with strangers, he who steps up? Graham's expression softened for the first time. Number. That was a one-time decision. Not one I'm proud of. But I had to see. I've spent millions hiring professionals, nannies, specialists, educators. None of them looked at him the way you did. Nia's voice was quiet now. He deserves more than that. I know. That's why I'm here. They stood in silence, the flickering light from the diner sign, painting shifting shadows across the linoleum floor. After a moment, Graham turned toward the door. My driver will be back for him in 10 minutes. Take the card. Think about it. He left without waiting for a response. Nia remained standing, watching the door close behind him. She glanced down at the card again, then at Liam, who stirred in his sleep and murmured her name. The next morning, Nia didn't go to work at the diner. Instead, she sat at her tiny kitchen table with the card in front of her, staring at it like it might explode. She'd made her living on tips and faith, never expecting more than survival. But now, something different was being offered. She picked up the phone and dialed, A crisp voice answered. "Mr. Whitaker's office." "This is Nia Reynolds," she said. "He said someone would call me. I'm calling first." The car that picked Nia up the next day looked like it belonged in a different world. Sleek, silent, and polished to a mirror sheen, it glided through downtown like it didn't belong to the same reality she'd known all her life. The driver opened the door for her with a nod, and for a moment, Nia hesitated. But then she remembered Liam's face, his small hands gripping a soup spoon, his eyes lighting up over a grilled cheese, and she stepped inside. The headquarters of Whitaker Dynamics loomed over the skyline like a glass monument to wealth and ambition. Inside, it was all chrome, marble, and silence too clean, too perfect. A receptionist led her through a private elevator and down a quiet hallway until she reached a wood-paneled office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made the whole city look like a toy set. Graham stood with his back to the door, looking out at the skyline. When he turned, he didn't smile, but his eyes softened slightly. "You came." Nia nodded, folding her arms. "You said you wanted me to help." "I do." He gestured toward a leather chair, and she sat cautiously. "I've hired experts," he said, sitting across from her. "But none of them connected with Liam the way you did. He's been through more than I can explain right now. He needs stability, presence, patience. I think you can give him that." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a therapist. I'm not asking for one. I'm asking for someone real." Nia looked around the office. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When you decide I'm not qualified anymore?" Graham's jaw tightened slightly. "If I'd judged you by your resume, we wouldn't be here. I'm judging you by your instincts." Silence fell again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time, just heavy. "I want to pay you well," he continued. "Better than what you're making now. There would be flexibility, a private apartment on the property if needed, access to anything you need to help him thrive." She blinked. "This sounds like a job offer wrapped in a test." "Maybe it is." She looked down at her hands, then out the window. "I'm not interested in saving rich men from their guilt." Graham didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help a kid who needs someone who sees him." Nia exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the chair arm. "I'm not used to this. People offering me things." Graham nodded. "I didn't expect you to say yes right away, but I hope you'll consider it. Not for me, for him." He stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a folder. "This has everything you need. Contract details, housing, medical info, Liam's schedule. Look it over." He handed it to her. "I won't pressure you. But Liam asked about you this morning." Nia took the folder, holding it like it might vanish. "Is he okay?" Graham looked at her carefully. "He smiled when I told him your name." That was all it took. 3 days later, Nia moved into a quiet guest suite in the Whitaker Estatia, beautiful, sunlit apartment above the garden courtyard, with a balcony that overlooked a small koi pond. The house was massive, filled with polished surfaces and staff that barely spoke. But Liam made it feel human. He greeted her at the door in his wheelchair, arms outstretched. "You came." Nia knelt beside him, hugging him gently. "Of course I did. Someone had to do a proper sandwich." Liam giggled. Graham watched from a distance, saying nothing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to control the moment. Days turned into weeks. Nia became a fixture in Liam's routine, reading to him, taking him to therapy appointments, helping him with schoolwork, but more importantly, just being present. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't treat him like he was fragile. She just showed up. One evening, Graham found them in the greenhouse. Liam was drawing, carefully sketching the koi fish in bright orange crayon. Nia sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "He used to hate drawing," Graham said softly. Nia smiled without looking up. "He doesn't hate it. He just needed someone to believe the things he made were worth seeing." Graham was quiet for a long time. "Do you ever wonder why I picked you?" Nia looked up. "I stopped wondering. You didn't pick me. He did." And in that moment, Graham realized she was right. One morning, Nia woke up to find an envelope slipped under her apartment door. No name, just her favorite color on the paper, a deep maroon, and a Whitaker Dynamics seal on the back. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant script. For someone who didn't ask for recognition but deserves it anyway. R. Beneath the note was a document. Full tuition scholarship to a university of her choice, in any subject, at any time. No expiration, no conditions. She stared at it for a long time. Later that day, she found Graham in the library, seated behind a massive desk, reviewing legal contracts. She stepped in, holding the envelope. "I didn't do this for a reward." "I know," he replied without looking up. "Then why this?" He set the pen down and met her eyes. "Because you poured yourself into my son, without asking for anything in return. You gave him safety, laughter, the ability to hope again. That deserves more than thanks." She shook her head slowly. "You don't owe me anything." "That's the thing," he said. "I do." He stood and walked around the desk, facing her directly. "For years I thought I could buy solutions, experts, strategies, but none of them gave Liam what you did with a bowl of soup and a smile. You changed his life." She swallowed hard, not sure what to say. Graham continued, more quietly now. "And maybe you changed mine too." That night, Nia stood by the balcony, the scholarship still resting on her table. She looked down at the garden where Liam played with a new sketchpad, his laughter floating up to her window like music. For the first time in years, she let herself consider the impossible. A future. Her own. Weeks later, Nia sat beside Liam during one of his art lessons. His hands were steadier now, his colors bolder. There was a vibrancy in him that hadn't existed before. Not just in his drawings, but in the way he spoke, the way he laughed, the way he looked forward to tomorrow. "Do you think people can change?" he asked, eyes focused on a streak of orange. Nia smiled. "I think people can choose, and that changes everything." Graham walked in a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of tea for Nia, one for himself. He sat beside them without speaking, just listening to the soft scratch of crayons and the rustle of leaves outside the open window. For a long while, none of them said anything. And then Liam looked up and asked, "Are we a family?" Nia and Graham exchanged a glance. It wasn't a question they'd prepared for. It wasn't even something they'd defined. But as Nia reached out and gently placed her hand over Liam's, and Graham nodded silently beside them, the answer became obvious. "Yes," Nia said softly. "We are." From a simple act of kindness on a rainy night to an unexpected second chance, their lives had intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted, and what began as a test turned into a partnership, a bond, a home. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures unlock the greatest transformations, not with grand speeches, not with wealth or power, but with grilled cheese, warm soup, and the courage to care when no one else would.